Welcome to the Baroque Age. This is lecture number 18 of Introduction to Fine Arts. And one thing that we might start to notice as we move forward further into the semester is that as we get closer to our present, we're going to see more similarities with ourselves. Now, the Baroque runs from the late 1500s till the mid 1700s, but definitely the whole span of the 17th century. 1600s is the Baroque age. And there are a lot of cultural issues to consider. Lots of sectarian wars, Protestants versus Catholics. Colonialism is in full swing now, and slavery drove much of the European economy and brought in a lot of new wealth. But most of the power was concentrated amongst the monarchs that ruled the different parts of Europe. There was a lot of internal soul searching within the Catholic Church and a renewal of Catholic sensibility. The Council of Trent was called by Pope Paul III as a response to the Reformation. They met multiple times over 3 decades, and what resulted was it reconfirmed the power of the Pope as the ultimate authority. It strengthened education and created new seminaries for priests, which helped a lot with the quality of person that they would have, which helped the issues with corruption and such. It also strengthened the power of church officials, because these were really guides to the laity. But they remained firmly resistant to the Protestant complaints about the excess of imagery in sacred art. They thought art should become less about decoration and more meaningful, and wanted art to appeal to the emotions and teach the laity. The church sought to further glorify itself by courting the finest artists to create extraordinary works. The Baroque period kicked off a scientific revolution. Thinkers such as Francis Bacon emphasized reason and logic and inductive thinking as pathways to knowledge. Inductive thinking is a mode of inquiry that reaches conclusions by moving from specifics to generalities, like modern scientific method. You have a theory, you can test that theory in a lab setting, and the results you get from that can provide evidence that you can use for a broader range of situations. This is Galileo, an Italian astronomer, built the first telescope. He went against church dogma that the earth was fixed. Galileo actually observed otherwise and proved Copernicus right. He was persecuted by the church in 1622 and deemed a heretic, and was forced to recant his findings under the threat of torture, and then died under house arrest. Johannes Kepler was a German mathematician who expanded on Copernicus' ideas of the sun-centered universe. He discovered that due to gravitational pulls, the planets orbited the sun in ellipses rather than perfect circles, and that relationships within the solar system are all based on mathematics. This is René Descartes, the French philosopher and mathematician. His Cartesian theory that in order to understand the universe, we must examine the principles of motion that pervade all aspects of it. That matter cannot be added to the universe or taken away. It just transforms. He used the inverse of inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning, a mode of inquiry that reaches a conclusion by moving from generalities down to specifics. He thought that mathematical logic is the only trustworthy means of understanding truth. Knowledge must rest on a secure foundation of reason, and that movement is not related to spirits, but by the movement of the planets, atoms, perpetual movement of bodies in space. His systematic rationalism, summed up in the phrase, "I think, therefore I am." And this was outside of any kind of supernatural revelation or intuition. Scientific rationalism was the search for knowledge. It must be guided by reason, testing of hypotheses, based on evidence from empirical observation as well as rational thought. Isaac Newton discovered the universal law of gravity and also separated light or color into the spectrum that we know. Next, let's look at two incredibly important philosophers, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. Both created social contracts in which society operates, and they had very different ideas about how that should happen. To Hobbes, humans are basically driven by the fear of death and the desire for power, and are at heart an unruly bunch that need to be taught how to behave. So for society to thrive, you have to have a single strong ruler, which is embodied in the political philosophy of absolutism. But to Locke, human beings are fundamentally good, and an absolute ruler isn't what makes a good society, but rather a government by and for the people. He came up with the original checks and balances system. In fact, both of these individuals influenced the United States founding fathers to an incredible degree. Regarding absolutism, absolute monarchies dominated the political climate in Europe in many regions. You might say that the influence of Hobbes was keenly felt. England had the Tudors, the French had people like Louis XIV. Both are good examples of absolutist systems. These rulers saw themselves as having a divine right to rule from God himself. It's sort of like, well, if I wasn't meant to be king, God wouldn't have born me into the lineage. So you see, that's proof. I should be king. As you might expect, papal and royal authority were sometimes in conflict with one another. Hobbes had the day, but the era of Locke was coming. The Baroque style in art emerges earliest in Rome, and it's associated with the Counter-Reformation, but not necessarily always religious in nature. And there are big regional differences as it spreads from Rome. Especially we'll see in the Dutch in particular were a totally different thing than what was happening in Italy. By the end of the Baroque period, the center of Western art would move out of Italy into France and stay there until World War II. The term Baroque is from Portuguese barroco, meaning an irregularly shaped pearl. And this was another derogatory term, just like Gothic was originally a derogatory way to refer to the art of that period. Same with Baroque. It was derogatory because the historians looking back at it thought it was just a little bit too melodramatic. And in fact, if you could use two words to sum up Baroque, drama would be one of them. It's about passion, about vast dramatic kind of themes and human emotion. And it's also about light. In a formal sense, light plays a role in every Baroque work of art in some way or the other. I think you would say Baroque art generally appeals to human emotion. Certainly the theatricality, even grandiose, like over-the-top theatricality. It's often active with dynamic compositions, and it was a real departure from the rationality of classicism or the Renaissance. But the Baroque still has one foot in the rational world. But above all, it's very diverse and not easy to pigeonhole, and there's so many important artists of the period that there's no way in the world we're going to discuss them all. So we're going to narrow it down to just a few. And we'll also discuss the architecture of the most grandiose palace ever constructed, commissioned by the most grandiose king ever, and that's the Palace of Versailles in France. But Rome was the epicenter of Baroque at the start. And the first person we're going to talk about is a painter. Caravaggio was one removed from Titian. He was the teacher of his teacher. So kind of in that same lineage, like Socrates to Plato to Aristotle, that kind of thing. He moved to Rome at the perfect time for an artist and got discovered, kind of like Giotto. It was kind of like a Hollywood story. The dramatic work he did was a perfect match for his dramatic and short life. And both his work and his life were very controversial. His work involved a radical sort of naturalism with a theatrical use of light and dramatic chiaroscuro, sometimes referred to as tenebrism. Caravaggio favored realism over classicism, and in fact had a disdain for past masters. He sought to work from nature and had little interest in studying classical models. He painted straight onto the canvas with minimal preparation. In fact, no known drawing by him even exists. And here is perhaps the most important painting. This is the Calling of St. Matthew. Levi, who later became Matthew, was a tax collector for the Romans. It made him very unpopular amongst his fellow Hebrews, but Jesus taps him for his inner circle anyway. When followers were stunned by his choice, he says, "I came not to call the righteous, but for sinners." This is the moment he is summoned by Jesus to join his crew. You see Jesus on the right, emerging out of the darkness, followed by a dramatic divine shaft of light that captures the eyes of Matthew. And it's a very commonplace setting, a tavern, that reflects Caravaggio's sense of realism. But it's still theatrical. Notice the languid hand of Christ. The hand, in fact, is a focal point, along with the face of Matthew, conspicuously similar to another famous hand that we looked at a couple chapters ago. And this is an example of appropriation, taking other images, existing images, and kind of using them in your own work of art. And everyone in Rome would have recognized that hand. And that's an interesting choice, especially given his disdain for past artists like Michelangelo. But anyway, the others in the tavern seem oblivious. They're busy counting the money on the table or talking to some old dude walking right in front of Jesus. Excuse me. And Matthew points at himself, as if to say, "What? Who, me?" And Jesus, "Yes, you're coming with me." This detail really shows the tenebrism I'm talking about, the dramatic lighting. And that word comes from the Italian tenebroso, or shadowy. And in fact, I would say that light and shadow are like almost the main characters of this painting. And Caravaggio had a very original style. Here are two more paintings, the Crucifixion of St. Peter and the Conversion of St. Paul. And Caravaggio ended up becoming very influential. He was known internationally. He was enigmatic, rebellious, and dangerous. And after these paintings, he was famous, wildly successful, and he didn't handle it very well. He would often work for a couple weeks, then go on a month-long bender, and he was a particularly belligerent drunk. In fact, in 1606, he killed a young man in a sword fight over either a tennis match or maybe a woman. But rather than face justice, he skipped town. And he was condemned to die, but sort of expected to be pardoned by the Pope. But while he was waiting for that pardon, he died from fever at the age of 38. So these paintings here were painted for the Cerasi Chapel in the Roman Church of Santa Maria del Popolo. And in both perspective and in the chiaroscuro, they were highly naturalistic. And in fact, what's another really interesting thing about it is the way that he puts the viewer like right up into the action. It's almost as if we're like in the painting rather than seeing it from a distance. It's like he could suck viewers into his paintings. And as if the figures in the paintings were on this like very shallow stage. Look at the painting on the right. We see Saul on his back with this intense foreshortening. Saul was a rather zealous persecutor of the Christians, as the story goes, On his way to Damascus one day to arrest some, he sees a blinding light and is knocked off his horse onto his butt. And then hears the voice of Jesus telling him to cut it out. And I guess it was pretty convincing. He converts to Christianity and changes his name to Paul. But this scene, it captures the moment right after he's knocked off the horse. And it's not on the road to Damascus, but rather in a stable, which was an everyday setting during Caravaggio's life, kind of like the tavern in The Calling of St. Matthew. Here's another painting by Caravaggio. Common scene. This is David with the head of Goliath. Many of Caravaggio's works involve close cropping. We only see what we need to see. And they involve muted tones with a nearly black background. And he uses light conspicuously as a spotlight and to create a sense of shock. Next, we'll talk about Diego Velázquez. He was the greatest painter of Spain at this time. He lived in Madrid and was a court painter to the king. He was famous for portraits and genre scenes as well as commissions for the Spanish court. He was also, as a Painters Guild member, he was responsible for the elevation of painting to a high art in Spain. And until that point, painting was thought of more as a craft. He studied Caravaggio and was himself a naturalist. He drew from life and studied nature. And this is his Las Meninas, or Meninas are the handmaidens of the Spanish princess here. There's interest in light and shadow, of course. It's formal in the sense that it's an official portrait, but it's also at the same time kind of informal because it captures an in-between moment rather than like a pose. Here is the entourage of the princess in the middle of something, but we don't really know what. It's candid. It has a quality of the everyday. And in fact, more than anything, it's a portrait of Velázquez himself. You can see him there, holding a paintbrush on the left. Likely this work captures the act of him painting the king and queen. You can see in the distance on the wall their image as if it was like a mirror. From this point of view, we'd be standing where they would be. So their theoretical position is the same as us, the spectator, looking into the painting. So it's almost like we're the king and queen. The space of the painting extends in that way out to the viewer, causing like a questioning of our role, sort of like the Arnolfini portrait by Van Eyck. And the subtitle is very appropriate because it kind of is more about the artist in his studio than anything else, like a day in the life of Spain's most important artist. Let's shift our attention north, in particular to Flanders. 17th century Flanders was under Spanish rule. At the time, it was known as the Spanish Netherlands, and Spanish equals Catholic. The Catholic Church commissioned important Counter-Reformation works, and the center was the city of Antwerp, where we find Peter Paul Rubens, whose family was exiled because of the Calvinist beliefs they had. He moved back to Antwerp when his father died and converted to Catholicism. Rubens was well-traveled, exposed to Italian and Spanish art. Eventually, he became the court painter to the Spanish governors of Flanders. A wealthy and learned man, he was successful in his own day. And his first major commission was this, the raising of the cross. This painting was done for the main altar of a church in Antwerp. And as an altarpiece, it had multiple panels. And here's the center panel. Nude figures writhing, sharp diagonal linear thrust in the composition, intense modeling, drama, emotion, and it really showcases his virtuoso technique. We see foreshortening, the twisted musculature, and this emotional and physical tension reinforced by the vivid chiaroscuro. This was counter-reformist zeal in its most exotic and almost violent way. The musculature creates a massive sense of weight. Christ looks upward toward the heavens, bathed in light. This was a human body in action, and that was really the main subject of that defined Rubens' work as a whole, is the human body in action. Rubens ran a massive workshop, and he therefore put out a ton of work. A lot of painting was done by his assistants. Does it matter? It wasn't that unusual. In this case, in this particular painting, Rubens did all the figures and his assistants did the sky for him. But no matter the painting, his domination of the process was absolute. And everything that came out of his studio had the indisputable mark of his style. Here we see the rape of the daughters of Leucippus. Fleshy figures, strong diagonals, exaggerated gestures, all the hallmarks of Rubens' style, especially in the classicizing of these human figures. The composition opens upward like a flowering of a bouquet. The color palette guides the viewer's eyes throughout the scene. This story comes from Greek mythology. Twin brothers Castor and Pollux forcibly abduct and, quote, marry the daughters of King Leucippus. And there's the putti again on the left behind the horse, signifying the onset of romantic love. And what did the brothers get as a penalty for this heinous act? They were granted immortality by Zeus. What are we to take out of this story? And why would Rubens paint such a thing? There are various interpretations, but clearly it's indicative of the inherent misogyny of Western civilization, and perpetuates in a way the terrible myth that sexual violence against women is okay, or maybe even secretly desired. But it can also be seen in light of the political realities of the time. And here again, I'm referencing the divine right of kings in an absolutist age. It kind of reinforces their right to impose their will. In fact, one facet of the Baroque involved the church and the counter-reformist, almost propaganda, or at least in the service of perpetuating counter-reformist aims of trying to convey the mystical experience of Christianity. Another aspect was the Baroque of the aristocratic class. Art in the service of reinforcing the social political order, like this one. Things were very different in Holland. The Dutch artists from there had a different sort of motivation. Dealt with a little bit less violent imagery. They secured independence from the Spanish rule in the late 16th century. And so it became primarily Protestant, and therefore there wasn't so much religious art around. Amsterdam was the financial center, and it was part of the rising power due to a strong economy. In the 17th century, it had the highest per capita income in all of Europe. It was also a republic rather than having an absolute ruler. So in some sense, power went through the citizens. There emerged an urban upper middle class of merchants and manufacturers, which dictated a real shift in the kind of imagery we see. Landscapes, still lives, portraits were very popular, scenes of everyday life, genre paintings. There was a prosperous middle class, and in fact, the average household in Holland had several paintings, including even not just middle class people, but even more successful working class people. Thus, the market for art was tremendous, and art really becomes a commodity. And it was a very competitive market. The first Dutch artist we'll discuss is, in fact, Europe's first truly capitalist artist, Rembrandt van Rijn. He studied Italian painting, had a large workshop himself, and was a real genius at eliciting human emotions, and like nearly every other Baroque artist we've discussed, his masterful use of light. He did an incredible amount of self-portrait over his many years. You can trace his exploits as time goes on. It was a real like rags to rags story, filled with lots of tragedies, like his wife dying and going through bankruptcy. Here, in the drawing on the left, is an anxious young lad, sort of sassy even, and then on the right is himself as a tired middle-aged man. Not that I can relate to that or anything. Rembrandt really transformed the buying and selling of art into something almost akin to what we have today. I think easily his most well-known art, commonly referred to as the Night Watch, we see how Rembrandt is famous for his use of light. We see figures emerging out of the darkness. This piece was commissioned by a civic guard company for a new meeting hall. And it was the most impressive new space in the city. Group portraits were a popular motif in Dutch painting at the time. But Rembrandt took this genre in a new direction. He was innovative, partly because it was so animated, rather than just being a pose. Here were these figures in action. We see dramatic lights and darks, very theatrical, rather chaotic. Everything is engaging in its own activity, which, sort of symbolic of a free people. It was called the Night Watch because it was sooty before it was restored in more recent years. Once it was cleaned, it was much brighter. Maybe early morning watch. But this piece, as well known as it is and important as it was also partly responsible for his downfall. Some of the subjects in the painting, were angry when they were kind of painted in the shadows. Remember, this was a group commission purchased by this group as a whole, and so the people who weren't handled the way they wanted to didn't like it very much. And after this controversy that emerged out of this, his commissions dropped off precipitously. But look at the light and shadow. Look at the shadow cast across the captain's body. I think the sense of light here is just amazing. And it's interesting, you see the young girl who seems to be like kind of bathed in a spotlight amidst all the shadowy areas. And here's perhaps his final self-portrait. And in it, we see a more subtle use of light and shade. It's more true to optical experience, perhaps, and with subtle modulations of color between the greens and the reds, a little bit of purples. It's interesting because the confident brushwork really contrasts with the vulnerable expression on his face. It's a non-specific setting, so the focus is on the psychological mood and the human condition. It seems to look more inward, depicting a man perhaps who's wizened over the years, but there's still a bit of a luminosity in his cheeks, kind of the chunky brushstrokes, the chiaroscuro, and a real contemplativeness and wariness. All right, so from the wariness of old age to youth and beauty. Here we see Johannes Vermeer, the girl with the pearl earring. And Vermeer really painted light, not people or objects. And if that sounds a little silly, what I mean is it's that sense of light that he captured. That's what vision really is. It really is light. And he had a way of capturing that essence. He painted only for local patrons, and it was almost always interior scenes that were really popular with middle class people. And it offers a glimpse into the lives of the people who lived in Holland at this time. And there aren't a whole lot of paintings that he did throughout his career. The themes were always secular, genre paintings, portraits like this one, Um, and he was also a master of composition. Vermeer often portrayed mysterious scenes where we're not really quite sure what's going on. There's an ambiguity. These interior domestic scenes have a subdued mood. Subtlety is certainly his forte, but he uses this subtle mood to create a credible sense of space, along with his sophisticated knowledge of perspective. Although that's something we'll talk a little bit about in a bit. Dutch home settings like this provide insight into everyday life of Dutch people, what a typical Dutch home would have looked like. Mostly they're paintings of women, not always. They're always contemplative with beautiful lighting. It's always the light. Quiet, peaceful, rich depth, highly illusionistic. But also, Vermeer is likely to have used a camera obscura to create these paintings. The camera obscura is a precursor of the modern camera. It's a box with a small hole, and rays of light form an inverted image across from the hole. The images have areas of soft focus, much like his paintings did. This claim has been debated vociferously. His works are often the perfect size for this method. They're relatively small. The subjects nearly always favor their left hand in his paintings. Whether they're holding a cup, a pitcher, a drawing implement, it's almost always in their left hand, which is a little fishy as well, because left-handed people aren't nearly as common as right-handed people. So there's plenty of circumstantial evidence to support the claim that he's using this camera obscura, as if that would be like cheating. But really the magic in his work is not about getting the proportional relationships correct. It's about light itself, and no projection technique can help with that. So I'm not really sure it matters if he used a camera obscura. Here we see a girl with the red hat. Value contrast set off the face. And there are like very particular formal choices that make the composition really strong. You consider where the highlights are placed. It forms a compositional triangle, and the face itself is kind of framed inside. She's just about to say something, so it kind of has that mystery about it. It's almost sensuous. See this muted background and a kind of warmth, shimmering highlights in her gaze. It's seductive. While the Dutch and Flemish painters were crafting masterpieces, Louis XIV in France was paving the way for French cultural domination of Europe. If the age of absolutism had one symbol, it's the Sun King. Meet Louis XIV, the longest reigning king in European history, over 72 years. He commissioned incredible amounts of art and made papal art collecting seem pedestrian. He knew the power of the image as much as Caesar Augustus did. And he really exemplified the opulent side of the Baroque. And Louis XIV consolidated rule over every part of society, the church included. And he certainly believed in the divine right of kings. Why wouldn't he? And the absolutist principle that the king's right to rule was a mandate from God. In order to stamp out the remnants of feudalism, he invited the noble elite to live with him at his modest little converted hunting lodge, an offer they couldn't refuse. I mean, literally, they couldn't refuse. That way he could keep an eye on them, and he could keep them from getting any rebellious ideas. And it also kept them from developing their own power back in their homes. But they didn't mind so much because his modest hunting lodge wasn't really very modest at all. In fact, it was the epitome of Baroque extravagance. I'm talking about the Palace of Versailles. So what became his court was really the nobility that he brought into his company, so to speak. in order that that they won't get any fancy ideas. But they lived in unparalleled luxury. There were sprawling gardens, meticulously manicured landscapes, dotted by sculptures and fountains, and sculptures by the finest artists in France. They created objects of such splendor that people clamored for them all over Europe. And this really became a new style, shades of what's to come when we talk about the Rococo movement. And keep in mind, at Versailles, Louis XIV could open his court's letters and spy on them, and he can concoct elaborate ceremonies to take up all their time, while he was busy consolidating all authority of the state the whole time, consolidating all to him. The Palace of Versailles became the symbol of the prominence of the French monarchy. The over-the-top quality of the whole place is emblematic of the Baroque. The Sun King eventually just moved his seat of power there in 1682, because might as well. But despite all the incredible painting and architecture, the supreme genius of the Baroque age was a sculptor. And his name was Gian Lorenzo Bernini. A devout Catholic, he rose to fame as a sculptor in Rome. But he was actually an architect and a painter as well. And his career was a wild ride. Here's Bernini's David from 1623. It defies gravity. It's dynamic. It depicts the moment of action, right as he's slinging the stone to hit Goliath. There's an intense expression on his face, high drama, and the virtuosity of the sculpting it's like marble made into flesh. Here's sort of a tally of the Davids we've looked at so far. Obviously, it's a popular subject. Notice the similarities. Donatello, early in the Renaissance, Michelangelo in the High Renaissance, and now here we see in the Baroque, Bernini's David. In 1638, he was commissioned to design and construct massive twin bell towers atop St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. He caused cracks in the facade of the church, and it had to be dismantled, the whole facade. Whoops. That was a spectacular fail, and Bernini's reputation was severely tarnished. But in 1645, he got the chance to redeem himself. And he certainly did so with the Ecstasy of St. Teresa. This was in the Cornaro Chapel of Santa Maria della Vittoria, and there's a distinct theatricality about this work. And in fact, about all of his work. And often these sculptures he made included a setting, almost as if it's like a stage. And here it is in context. And we can see that there's not only the stage where the action is playing out, but if you look at the far right and the far left of this photograph here, you see even a built-in audience for the stage. On these balconies, and it's interesting. Those are sculptures too that you see there, and they're sculptures of the Cornaro family who commissioned the work. So Saint Teresa was a Spanish nun of the Carmelite order, and she was known for her trances and visions in which she saw an angel with a fire-tipped arrow that plunged into her heart. And this made her swoon in delightful anguish. Quote, "The pain was so great that I screamed aloud, but at the same time I felt such infinite sweetness that I wished the pain to last forever. It was not physical, but psychic pain. Although it affected the body as well to some degree, it was the sweetest caressing of the soul by God." And I can't help but think of Hildegard von Bingen with regards to this story. And in the sculpture here, the saint's rapture is obvious. Um, and, and just the look on her face and the position of her body. Um, and also in fantastically Baroque style, there's a raking light that comes in from a hidden window that's placed above the sculpture. And this hidden direct light source creates an intense chiaroscuro. There's the turbulence of the drapery swirling around. It's almost an orgasmic celestial explosion. And on that note, I'll leave you this evening with a composer, Johann Sebastian Bach. Bach's style is characterized by a lot of notes, simple motoric rhythms, and steady shifts of underlying harmony. In fact, he explored harmony much more deeply than other composers of the time. Have a listen and see if you can envision this music in the context of the visual art we've discussed. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.